Oh no, there we go.
Hello, and thank you for joining us in this webinar, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Project Scoping and Delivery. I'm Maria Ellis, Urban Mobility Economic Equity Manager at ODOT. The agency is working to ensure equity is integral to how we approach project selection and delivery. Our strategic action plan centers equity and states that by 2030, we will prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion by identifying and addressing systemic barriers to ensure all Oregonians benefit from the transportation services and investments that we make. We know that achieving this takes a lot of work and many shifts on our part, but we will know that we're on the right path if we start seeing the following: that we have policies and processes and procedures that promote a diverse workforce, that we establish and nurture strong partnerships with businesses owned by Black, Indigenous, people of color, women, and others who have been historically or are currently continuing to be marginalized. That our projects and programs prioritize the agency's social equity vision in their planning and risk assessments. And that all voices in the communities that ODOT serve are heard and their viewpoints influence the agency's programming and project decisions. The transportation investments we make benefit neighborhoods and communities that have experienced systemic harm in the past. And that our industry partners and program partners are held accountable to and aligned with ODOT's social equity vision. Embedded in all of this is the goal of creating more economic opportunity as a result of our work. ODOT invests hundreds of millions of dollars every year in projects across the state. Our goal is to leverage these investments to promote economic opportunity for BIPOC and women-owned firms. This matters because too often the benefits that we and other public agencies make are not shared equally among Black and Brown communities. As a public agency, we have an opportunity and a responsibility to take an economic development approach to this work that not only delivers good infrastructure, but lifts up communities, workers, and small BIPOC and women-owned businesses along the way. Right now, ODOT is undertaking efforts to understand the unique barriers faced by BIPOC and women-owned businesses in contracting with ODOT. The goal is to be able to dismantle these barriers and create more opportunity. We're trying to support the development of BIPOC and women-owned businesses so that they can scale up and create more wealth and jobs as a result. And we're trying to implement programming and policies that materially expand opportunities for these firms so that they can equitably participate in our contracting. Today, we are going to hear from folks working at and alongside ODOT as we aim to make these shifts. You will hear about efforts in creating more meaningful access to project selection and scoping, and our efforts in creating employment and wealth creation opportunities for small businesses in our projects. Enjoy the discussion.
So we're going to go first to Justin. Justin, where would you go in Oregon and how would you get there before you get started?
Oops, was muted. I'm Justin Burnt. I'm the statewide scoping and non-certified local agency program manager, and I would go to the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, most likely driving because of how far it is from here. So, in regards to scoping in the context of diversity, equity, inclusion. So ODOT has come up with some new processes, tools, trying to make some improvements in regards to how we go through our scoping process in order to make sure that we're more inclusive, that we are thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion. Some of the ways that we're doing that are, so we've developed a few new processes. So we're now in scoping, thinking about these different items to make sure that they're being addressed, to make sure that we're thinking about the opportunities that may come up while we're doing scoping, while we're thinking about our potential scope schedules and budgets for our new projects coming up into the newest STIP. So with these new processes, of course, we need some kind of a tool in order to document this. So we're ODOT had come up with the cost estimating tool over the last year and a half, 2 years. And what this tool really allows us to do is take all the information that we're gathering from scoping and put it into primarily one source of information, one large document, and document, well, what did we think about? How are we coming up with the estimates for these projects? How are we developing the scope to see, okay, we have all these wonderful things our engineers are coming up with, that our funding program managers have helped us come up with. We think we know what the needs of our systems are. Well, what about diversity, equity, inclusion? So making sure that we have processes in place during scoping in order to look at this. So our funding program managers are in the best place early on in the process in order to look at, well, what preliminary engagement was done? So was there a planning process? Was there any preliminary engagement with any particular groups, associations, areas that may be pertinent to a particular upcoming project? Taking that, incorporated into what we use as our first document, which is a business case that kind of at a very high level describes the scope, schedule, and budget of a project. That business case comes to our scoping teams at the regions, and with that business case, the regions put together the CET, and with the CET, the funding program manager will answer some very basic questions, which we'll get to here in a few minutes. They'll be looking at the social equity area map. That's one of the maps that ODOT has. It includes the social equity index for different areas. So when looking at a particular project, looking at the extents of that project, we can see, okay, what are the groups, what should we be looking at in regards to social equity, diversity, and inclusion? So what are some of the populations we may want to reach out to? What are some of the things we may want to discuss? When we get into the actual scoping of these projects, of course, having those conversations between the funding program managers and our design teams of looking at opportunity. So not just for the engagement, but looking at the opportunities of how we may be able to better our projects, better the communities, better the inclusion and diversity of how we're approaching our projects. Some of the other considerations while we're going through the scoping process and developing the scope, schedule, and budget would be looking at different types of contracting, which some of our other folks will be discussing a little later. Also looking at our selection award processes. Once we have all this scoping information put together, how are we going to look at it from a selection standpoint, ensuring that we're looking at not just the when the project's going to come out or how much it costs, but also looking at who's it going to impact and how are we going to use these projects to best benefit our communities. And of course, we want to ensure that we're taking these processes, looking for opportunities in order to better be more diverse, be more equitable into the design, not just in scoping. So ensuring that we're taking the CET, that we're taking these discussions into design so that when we are designing these projects, when they are selected and awarded, that we continue thinking about these things. And then since this is this is pretty much the first iteration of a lot of these discussions, after this current scoping season is done, trying to develop some metrics in order to ensure, okay, what did we do and what can we do better for next time? Next slide, please. So just as a quick reference, here's a brief look at our state equity index map. Different colors showing different amounts, well, different types of state equity. If anyone has any particular questions for this, I would specify, well, that may be a good question for Shane Whittington later. Next slide, please. So just quickly, some questions that are being addressed as part of this scoping effort. So we have different questions for our scoping our funding program managers, as well as other questions for our scoping teams. So primarily the funding program managers, they're going to be looking at, well, what has been done in the past, what can they easily look at? So the maps, the social equity index, what have been historically some of the people that have been excluded in the past, providing the basis for what our scoping teams are going to want to look at. Giving us a base of, okay, here are the groups, here are the communities, here are some of the people that we need to be thinking about, who we may need to be engaging with. And then the scoping team's trying to figure out, well, how can we best engage with those people? How are we going to impact them with our project? How can we ensure that whatever we do, we're keeping all those communities, we're keeping equity, diversity, inclusion in the back of our minds, hopefully bringing that to the front of our minds and thinking about how are our projects impacting these people? Next slide, please. So quickly, that covered roughly what we're doing in regards to scoping. So we're thinking about engagement. We're thinking about how we're affecting all these different communities with the different types of projects that ODOT does. We're trying to ensure that we have some formation of what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, and thinking about diversity throughout the entire process. So not just thinking about it, but also acting upon it, looking for those opportunities, and then following through with those those opportunities when we get into design of the project.
Thank you, Justin. And we'll have questions at the end. Next up is Shane. Shane, I need to ask you the same question. Where in Oregon would you go and how would you get there?
Oh, you know what? I had an original answer that there's a lot of places in Oregon I have not been to, so I'd like to go there. There is the Crater Lake I have not been to. That's a place where I'd really like to go. Usually I am a bike commuter, so usually I would ride my bike. That place is a little far from me. I think it's about 2.5, 3 hour drive away from where I am. So I wouldn't ride there, but when I got there, I would definitely bring my bike along with me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so you can go to the next slide. So I'm program manager in the Office of Social Equity, focusing really on engagement and what that means statewide. The first thing that I'd like to always talk about is the strategic mandate that we have from our strategic action plan. And I really just always like to highlight the second paragraph, which states implementing a social equity engagement framework across ODOT will ensure our engagement efforts are more inclusive, efficient, resulting in more effective delivery of a modern, equitable transportation system. We are also building a culture within ODOT to be able to understand and identify and effectively address unconscious bias. So that is really critical and important to starting to understand how we're moving about engagement and what we're trying to do statewide. This excerpt is just critical in thinking about how we also execute the social equity and engagement and what it means for you in your daily duties. So when we engage equitably at ODOT, we are constantly considering two things. The first thing is the process of equity, meaning we are always recognizing that not all people or communities are starting from the same place due to historic and current systems of oppression. And second, we are focusing on outcomes of equity. So meaning the tangible effort to provide different levels of support based on an individual or group's needs in order to achieve fairness and outcomes. Next slide. I think often when we look at ODOT as a whole, when we look at our projects, we often use the transportation project lifecycle as a graphic. But ODOT is so much more than this graphic. in a lot of different ways. But as we talk about projects that are on this delivery cycle, it's a really good graphic to zero in on where we visually place engagement. And that is indicated by the little blue people that you see here on the map. There are many projects and programs that exist on this portion of thinking through our projects and how we're involved with communities. But what I'd like to zero in on is for us to consider and think about where engagement happens and where we are shifting it. So at the moment, we see where engagement happens, but we need to work through and ask everybody in their individual positions and roles where they see gaps, and then where we can think through how we fill those gaps as we start to think about the daily duties that we have. Many people ask me, okay, so how do I know that? How do I do that? And what do I need to do? So the IAP2 framework helps us understand, and it is the foundation of where we build engagement here at ODOT. So next slide. So when people are asking me this question, I think the IAP2 framework is a good place to start. So we all know practicing equitable engagement is complex and it's achievable. So when we think about equitable engagement, we must first recognize that not everybody is in the same place, right? But we want to use this to help us understand when we are thinking about our roles, where do we exist on here, right? So I want us to consider and think about when you see this informing, consulting, involving, collaborating, and empowering. When you think about how you and your position and your role here at ODOT equitably engage, where do you exist currently in one of these categories? So then we can start to think about your duty and your roles and the functions that happen within and around you, because all of these impact our plans and our actions that we are working with communities on. So right now, a lot of our projects are in the scoping portion. And in this phase, we know that scoping is narrowing down, the purpose, needs, solutions of the project, also identifying just what the larger scope is, specifically around schedule and budget. And then we start to think through the impact and risk. But what we all need to know is that when we are considering these different pieces, know that they are enhanced and expanded when we are considering constantly how equity and engagement is happening in these different phases. Next slide. So here are just a few overall categories when we start to think about stakeholder identification and the data that we're gathering. But when we are considering these different pieces and these categories of who, what, when, where, why, and how around our stakeholders, that is very specific to our roles and our duties that we carry out, but we also need to zoom out, right? And we need to consider a lot of the projects that we are currently working on within the project lifecycle and outside of the project lifecycle. So we want to ensure that project managers, HR, planners, engineers, the DMV, maintenance, and many other teams know who to consult and how to involve, right? And those are places where we want to shift from inform to consult and involve in a lot of our duties and areas around ODOT. But particularly, we really want to consider those who have been historically and are currently marginalized. And as we think of how we can do that, we have the social equity index map to ensure that no community is missed, and we want to highlight where they're located. Next slide. So the social equity index map is a geographical demonstration of how important it is to understand not only who is impacted, but where they reside as we build and maintain a reliable multimodal transportation network. So this map allows us to make data-driven decisions with understanding where home is for Oregon's most vulnerable populations, like BIPOC populations, and that includes tribal nations, Asian Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiian, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Black people over 65, limited English, disability, and poverty. So when you look at this map, these are things that you're observing in the different color gradients. And superimposed on top of that are the projects that are currently functioning. So we want to focus on vulnerable populations because the impact of our investments are felt deeply, consistently, and often faster in high index spaces, right? So those that experience these burdens on our projects, programs, and through our policies, we want to make sure that we are connected with them and we know where they exist and we can visualize that as we start to carry out our work. So tools like this should help us make better decisions on project selection and the specifics entailed thereafter. So we should always keep in mind when using these tools that one size does not fit all. So where engagement happens and is doing well in one area or specifically one region does not mean that it will happen the same way in another region, but we do want to uphold the quality of work that happens when we are collecting the qualitative and quantitative data that surrounds equity and engagement. So one of the things that we do that is a guiding barrier is to think about the social equity lens, which is on the next slide. So this helps us better understand our work and how our teams can make more meaningful shifts. This exists on the cost estimating tool that Justin indicated earlier, the CET, and this is for projects and programs. So questions like this need to be answered early and often and across program and project teams. It has to be something that is shared widely and something that we constantly revisit. Next slide. So as we start to think about our equity and engagement in the delivery and operations, we have an aim, right? And we must equitably engage community intentionally, early, and often. I cannot say that enough. And we need to do it in a meaningful way and in a way that connects with the community. Not just the way in which we are informing, but in a way that we are also connecting and they are informing us, right? So we want to always be consistently assessing and advancing shifts in the work that we do. And then here are a couple questions I have. So what is our current culture, right? And what practices and tools can we use to get there? Oftentimes we can use other teams and other regions as models and then make those amendments and those adjustments according to our regions, right? And then lastly, we want to always be accounting and evaluating and revisiting a lot of these different pieces, right? So where are we strong, right? Where do we need to stretch? And then what do we need to do to get there? And these are just questions that I work through and I'm constantly processing. And believe me, this is not easy to do, but it is something that we are trying to do and that we can get better at, right? And so when we are doing this and we are being guided by these equity questions in the way that we do our work, we want to make sure that we're always and constantly thinking about the short-term and long-term decision-making practices that we do in our process that lead us to identify known inequities and the unique barriers that happen in certain communities when it comes to transportation access and outcomes. So as we start to think about equity engagement, believe me, we can do it and we are working hard on it. It is not an easy place to be, but it is an achievable place and it is a place that we can make a lot of impact for our communities.
So thank you so much, Shane. Appreciate that. We're going to go to Andre. I'm not sure why I have reverb.
Good afternoon. I'm Andre Baugh, and the place I'd like to go in Oregon are the Steen Mountains. It's beautiful down there. I've been down there previously a couple of times, but would like to go back. And I'd like to go in an electric pickup, however, when they're readily available, and hopefully they have charging stations. So that's something to look forward to from that standpoint. I'm a consultant and I've worked with ODOT for about 20 years. Currently, I'm the DBE lead on Interstate Bridge, working with the GEC there. the Rose Quarter project and I-205. Today I'm going to talk to you about the things that Justin and Shane have talked about, how they translate really into the ideas of the following factors around DBE participation, workforce, and accountability, the things that Maria talked about, and these ideas of, you know, at the end of the day, Maria was talking about how is ODOT going to meet its strategic action plan around equity and inclusion and diversity. And those are key components of as we look at these factors. First, the type of procurement. Justin touched on this a little bit, but what is the type of procurement that the project you're working on will be? It's an alternative bid type and the equity provision. So we'll touch on is it a design build because of the equity considerations and social equity considerations, along with all of the other engineering issues. CMGC, currently there's low bid, and A plus C, D. Which of those, again, the social equity factors factor into choosing a procurement type? Federal aid or state funded projects. Again, there's that inclusion of those factors into that decision making. Secondly, and maybe not secondly, is DBE participation. There's obviously a DBE goal setting practice that is carried out by OCR, but there is also the inclusion of a DBE plan. And that really is an opportunity for ODOT to, in partnership with the community and the contractor, to develop a plan of how they're going to meet the DBE goal, how they're going to include these communities that have been maybe not participated fully in the past in DBE projects. How do they include them this time? How do they package the project to have more inclusivity of DBE firms? And DBE is Disadvantaged Business Enterprise. That is a federally approved designation. To be a DBE, it must be 51% owned by a minority or female under the federal guidelines, and the Office of COBID, which certifies firms in Oregon, and they must be Oregon certified to achieve the DBE goal. Is a percentage of the contract value that must be achieved. It's set by the Office of Civil Rights, the goal, and that goal must, that percentage is achieved by the DBE firms participating in the project by dollars. The other part of this is that the DBE packaging, how do they package it? Looking again, as you think about the community in which you're working, are there smaller firms, larger firms? Thinking about that. One thing I would take away also is outreach. Notifying, ODOT does a very good job of notifying the prime contractors or specialty contractors on contracts before the project comes, to let them know that it's coming down, get it in their schedule, get advice. As Shane said, start early, start often. Do the same thing with the DBE community. Notify them, let them get it into their schedule. Outreach to them for suggestions. Again, it's making it inclusive. As you look at this, Maria talked about gaining trust, gaining support. These are ways that the DBE community feels, those contractors feel included, the BIPOC community feels included in the project. Next slide. Again, further efforts, workforce. Workforce is looking at ODOT doesn't hire the workforce, but workforce in today's market is a scarcity commodity, really. We don't think about it a lot of times, but workforce is driving up prices. Just today, the carpenters received a $10 an hour increase in their wages in Washington. I suspect that will translate down into Oregon. Those will impact costs of projects. Carpenters are a substantial part of the workforce on bridge projects, especially. So thinking about how do we get ahead of the project and notify workforce providers apprenticeship programs. There are apprenticeship programs across the state, from Klamath Falls to Ontario, to Southern Oregon, Ashland, Medford, Roseburg, Eugene, Salem, up and down I-5, and in Eastern Oregon Bend, to include that the workforce providers know that there is a project coming, that they know about a time frame it's going to show up, so they can start anticipating a contractor calling them for workers. Hopefully they're hiring workers from the local area. Even if they're bringing their own workers, they still need to get workers. And so the apprenticeship recruitment of new apprentices, looking at not only apprenticeship, but how do we, as ODOT, get to careers? So get out of apprenticeship and get those people through projects, and so they become journey. That increases the pool. That increases the diversity of the pool also, apprenticeship. And that's a way to have more people locally available around the state, so they're not just in certain pockets, if you will, but they're around the state, able to meet the workforce needs of projects as they come available from ODOT over the coming years. The other thing is this workforce diversity. Looking at aspirational targets for females and minorities, and making sure, again, notifying the workforce that providers that in the communities that there's opportunities here. Many, as Maria said, some communities have been underserved in the workforce in construction. Just that's a global fact. And how do we include more of those? One is just letting them know of the opportunity early, given the opportunities to for workforce providers to recruit those individuals from those less connected communities, provide them on-ramp to get involved in apprenticeship and become skilled career journeymen down the road. That helps ODOT, build quality projects in the future in a very diverse manner. Another potential that ODOT is working on is a local zip code priority hiring provision. It's a special request to the Federal Highway Administration. It's called SEP 14 zip code hiring. That would allow a contractor, ODOT, to direct the contractor to hire a percentage of the workforce from a local area around a project. And again, this is an opportunity it's not minority based or female based, but it's just individuals to put back in socially economic depressed areas money through the local hiring of individuals. Lastly, I would say you have TARO goals. In some areas, TARO goals are assigned. Again, that's connecting with some communities that have not been included in the past, and specifically working with TARO organizations to include their members as part of the workforce. And again, diversifying the workforce, providing those skills, those career opportunities, and really economic opportunities, not only around contracting, but around workforce, which provide for the better communities and areas which ODOT serves. Next slide. And lastly, Maria, just connecting back to how these translate is accountability. Ensuring the contractor meets its commitment to the community, ensuring ODOT, it's not only the contractor, but ODOT and the community, that we're all accountable to trying to have this better community. And but this is this goes to, gaining the trust. It's not like big projects, but it's small projects. And it's how do you go back to a community and say, you asked for, we gave you, and having that accountability. And that really is monitoring, reporting, and compliance. It's monitoring the goals that are set, the social equity, and all the other budget and schedule. But it's also reporting back and saying how you're doing, good or bad. That brings accountability and transparency to the community that you care, and that you want them to know how you're doing, and that you are living up to what you talked to them about, and you did listen. And this goes to as Maria said, the BIPOC contract expansion work that ODOT's working on from that standpoint. Thank you. I guess it's questions now.
It is, and thank you so much. Appreciate that. So our panelists are going to start taking questions. I have a bunch, so I will start. And actually, while you're on still, Andre, one of the questions was, could you define DBE?
Yes, I thought I did that, but I will go back to it. DBE is Disadvantaged Business Enterprise, is a federal highway designation. And to be a DBE, first you must be a disadvantaged individual, and secondly, the firm that must be owned 51% by a designated category by the federal government, and that those categories are Black or African American, Hispanic, Asian Pacific, Asian Indian, Native American, and then there's that's it. So in female. So if you're in that category, in any of those categories, those are federally categories, you can be certified. Each state has its own certification. So in Oregon only recognizes Oregon certification. If you're from another state, you must, and you're certified as a DBE, you must come to Oregon and get certified. You can participate on the project, but you don't count toward the goal. The DBE goal is set by the Office of Civil Rights. Oregon has a DBE plan that is federally approved and a methodology for goal setting. And that goal is created out of that goal setting methodology based on the cost of the project, the availability of DBEs, the availability of the scope, and what's being built. So it varies based on whether you're building a bridge or you're just paving, whatever the type of project is. There's different availabilities of DBEs in and around the area, so it's localized. Portland may have a different DBE goal than Klamath Falls or Ontario, just because of where it's located. So those are factors that go into the DBE goal. But DBE goals, again, DBE goals or DBEs are individuals that have some type of disadvantage and are owned by a minority recognized by the federal government or a female. And I say that there are Caucasian males that do qualify, but they're very rare from a nationwide standpoint. But that is a DBE.
Thank you so much. I am having a little technical issues, so I am working it both ways. I have another question. It says, I struggle a lot with consult and involve when it comes to identifying engineering solutions. If the primary project solution, i.e. roundabout, and it's non-negotiable based on data and performance measures, what does consult and involve the general public look like in this context? Shane?
That's fine. That's a good question, and that's a question that we get often. One of the policies that we have now is the equitable engagement compensation policy and program, and that is something that everyone in every department can utilize as of July 1st, 2021. And that is a policy where people do have to be eligible, and the eligibility requirement is that they cannot be compensated by their job or any other third party in order to be involved. And that is where people can hold targeted and specific feedback sessions with people from the community or areas of interest when we are doing a specific project and what that means. And that way we can better connect with the community. And that takes us into, rather than informing, that is a practice in consulting and involving our communities in a more intentional way, in which we are also consulting them and compensating them for their feedback. When we look at the specific data and measurement points, we want to take those into consideration at all points in time, but we also want to test our assumptions here. So we can utilize those data and those measurement points with the community when we are doing engagement, and we can also use that data and performance measures outside of our specific duties and roles. So when you think about the project team, it is often assumed that everyone is on the same page and everybody knows the same information, right? But I'm not sure if that's always true, right? So in the location and in the duties and the job that you have, I think that a lot of times we can communicate more with the team, people who have already completed their section, and go back and reflect with them to ask more questions, more equitable questions. And that's why the social equity lens is there to ask those questions. And the earlier we ask them, the better. And some of those things do trickle down right throughout the process. But for those points where there may be some places of pause, I would hope that on our project teams and our project and program managers, that at those points where we are struggling with consulting and involving, that we have those reflection points and those points where we can ask our own teams internally, as well as aligning them with our external engagements about the communication that's happening to make better decisions. Justin, I'm not sure if you have more specifics outside of that.
So I just wanted to speak up for a moment. So Shane, what you provided is great in regards to the broader context. So more specific to the question about a roundabout is, yes, the data that we have may already point to a specific solution. That's not to say that we're not involving the local communities. That's not to say that we're not going to think about other opportunities in regards to what we already have for a solution. So maybe, yes, the overall solution from a data standpoint is a roundabout. Well, there may be other solutions that the community needs that we also need to address within our solution. So maybe we need to provide a specific crosswalk from one location to another. Maybe we need to incorporate some kind of bike ped facility that goes around a particular direction in order to steer certain persons from one spot to another, create better access and transportation for not just one mode but several modes due to where we're putting that roundabout. So listening to what the communities are telling us, listening to what is coming out of the engagement that Shane was explaining, and trying to incorporate, well, okay, yes, we have a roundabout, but maybe we can incorporate some of these other things into that same solution so that we're not just doing what we need for a traffic need, but we're incorporating the broader perspective of how we can better the entire community that we're impacting.
So thank you both for that. Next question. Projects often come from planning efforts. What are we doing to ensure we're incorporating equity and engagement in planning? What plans we choose to fund, what we measure, how we engage impacted communities, etc.
So I'm sure Shane has some to add to this, but I'll be brief. So in regards to planning, generally we have some kind of public engagement that we want to do. So with that, now the Office of Social Equity is providing us some additional tools in order to do that. We of course want to take the opportunity to ensure we're using those tools, we're using the resources that they're providing in order to do that. So when we're looking at a plan, not just looking at it from, again, the perspective of okay, we have this data, it's telling us to do this. Looking at, well, who can we get involved in order to ensure that we understand the full context of what we're looking at for our plan? Is our plan only addressing a mere transportation need based on data, or are we also addressing reaching out to the local communities? Are we reaching out to those who may be disadvantaged? Are we reaching out and ensuring that we're getting the entire context of what we're actually planning to do and how that's changing over time? Because when we make the initial plan, by the time that becomes a project, that may have substantially changed of what the needs are. So keeping that engagement consistent all the way through the planning effort, through scoping, design, and construction to ensure that we're continuously engaging and involving those people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an excellent answer, Justin. Thank you. The only thing that I will add to it is that I know that in planning does engagement, right? But there's also engagement that happens further down the line, right? And I often am asking questions of, okay, so are people in planning talking to community affairs folks, right? And PIO officers and all these people who are doing the engagement later that happens. And oftentimes I am not always sure if that is happening, right? So that's why I was saying that that the internal team, we need to allow and create pathways for us to communicate with people who are doing engagement the entire time in the process. So if we know that it is coming along later, are we communicating with those people who may be closer to the community, right? And that is usually the community affairs or the PIOs in our different regions and what that means. But when we're looking at planning, there are, the plans that are put together often are developed really early, and the strategies that happen around engagement with those groups and communities, and the budget that's attached to that, as the project starts to evolve and we do start to engage with community members, sometimes those things we would hope would be shifted, and that's what Justin is talking about, and I agree with that. Is that hopefully we can open up some more opportunities, and that's why we want to engage earlier and as often as possible, and we have the means to do that, which is through the equitable engagement compensation policy and program, in which we can do those things. And I would love for that to start in planning, right?
Very good. Thank you so much. Here is a question everyone has. Can the panel suggest ways to increase the level of engagement during scoping, given that the regions have a very short time to scope and develop estimates for a large volume of possible projects?
So I'll take a quick whack at it first. So yes, there are things we can do. So if there is any preliminary engagement during planning or subsequent or prior phases of what could be part of the project, or looking at our overall transportation plan, there should be some form of engagement with those activities. So, and what did that consist of? Taking those, what did happen prior to when we're scoping a project, taking that into the next level. Okay, what has happened before? Who was contacted? Who was engaged? And then having that frequent contact with the funding program manager to see what exactly did happen in the past. Have they looked at the equity index map? Do they know of other communities that may be impacted by what they're proposing for a project? Getting that initial information so that as soon as you are able to start that scoping effort, you have some additional context of what the project is, what has happened before, so you know, okay, maybe this group was missed, and how to engage that, or how to plan for that engagement going into design.
Thank you, Justin. Shane, Andre?
Yeah, I think that a lot of times, what Justin is saying is just right on point, right? And a lot of times when we're doing this work, it's interesting the tools that we use, right? And how we start to think about how we're using those different tools and how we're actually answering the question. I think a lot of times when we're thinking about equity and engagement, we need to be considering how that decision was made, who made that decisions, what assumptions are attached to the root of where the problem exists when we're starting to think about barriers and we're thinking about projects in particular. The resource that I would give is that there's a lot of resources on the Office of Social Equity website, the intranet site. We don't have an external site yet. We're working on that. But I will refer a lot of people to some of the questions that are being asked. If you want to connect with, with me directly, in a lot of ways, or Justin, or Andre, I guess I'm gonna throw everybody out there, or even Maria. Our emails are there because I know we're short on time. But on the Office of Social Equity website, if you when you go to it, on the left-hand side, it says, I'm looking at it now, diversity action teams, social equity partners, social equity resources, the equitable engagement conversation. Our intranet site is going to evolve and it's going to be updated soon. But right now, if you go to social equity resources, there are talks that happen where people can view those conversations, and specifically Nikatris Perkins, the assistant director of the Office of Social Equity, just did a talk on the social equity lens in particular and specifically. So that is already recorded, and people can revisit it, take notes, and really start to ask more informed questions after they've visited those different pieces that are specific to their project and the barriers that may exist on their teams as well.
I would just say one thing, when you're planning out there, one thing to ask is, who's not on your list that you traditionally, as you think about equity and equity lens, who's not on your list that you traditionally would, when you look at your list, you probably put together a list of people you're going to contact and outreach to. Who's not on that list? And your community, you drive around your community every day, and the project area. Who's not there that you see on the street, that you see in the paper around, different ethnicities or homeless organizations, things that you normally don't think about in equity from a project standpoint, who's not on the list. And when I look at it, that's what I kind of think about, because there's people every time. It's the the business association, yes, got them. I've got the mayor, and I've got those kind of people. But do you have some other groups that historically have not been utilized or not been included in just informing them that a project's coming?
Good advice. Justin, did you have something you wanted to add? I seen your hand went up and went back down.
I see this question leading into about 5 others. And so just knowing that, as I said earlier, the scoping this round is kind of like the first iteration. We know there's a lot of questions pertaining to social equity. We know the questions are not easy to answer, and there's not a lot of guidance or context being added to it at the moment. That's not to say that myself or Shane or others aren't available in order to help either answer or help just have a discussion around how to answer those questions, how to deal with, okay, we want to do additional engagement. What else can we do? We're open to those discussions. We can help you figure out a solution in order to do that. And I would say it's not too late. So if there is a big project or a small project, or any of our projects that we're currently scoping or would like to scope sometime in the future, feel free to reach out to either one or all of us, and let's have a discussion. And then we can ensure that we involve the right people in order to get you a direction to get there. And after this first iteration of scoping that is starting to address diversity and equity, we will have additional context and better guidance next time so that we have a better approach. So we greatly appreciate any questions or issues that are popping up so that we can address those for later.
So thank you. I want to say thank you to the panel. We're at 11:58. It's about to be 11:59. And I know some of these questions will take you into the midnight hours, actually. So we do have the questions. Shane, thank you for getting on and answering some as we go. And Karen Criswell, thank you so much for jumping in also. I want to say thank you to our panel. I also want to just kind of reiterate one of the things that Shane said, be intentional, make it early, and do it often. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.